What's up, everyone? God and Physics. That's the conversation today with Matt from Physically Debunked. We're talking about, he's an atheist. We're going to be talking about different arguments like the cosmological and fine-tuning argument, Matt's story, and just the nature of science and all kinds of fun stuff. So, Matt, what's up, man? How you doing?
Hi, I'm very good, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. I'm super excited for this conversation. And I mean, I've listened to some of your stuff, which is why I wanted to have you on, because I was like, this could be a really fun conversation, lighthearted,
Want
but
to
also
challenge
just
some of
really
the things I've said.
practical. Yeah, I know. I have this giant list here on my iPad where it's 18 million things. That's we're gonna go through them one by one. But no, we're just gonna be talking about God and physics and a little bit of Matt's journey. So to get things started, Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about who you are and what you do and what got you interested in where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So currently I'm a PhD student in physics at Queen Mary University of London, so here in London. So I'm a PhD student in cosmology. So this is a kind of area where there's some ripe crossover sometimes for thinking philosophically and theologically. In particular, I look at my PhD is in very early universe, so looking at kind of the earliest period in the history of the universe that we can really say anything sensible about, which is inflation. Okay, so inflation is just this incredibly rapid expansion at the really tiny fraction of a second just after the Big Bang. And yeah, it's the only place, it's the furthest we can get back in time, really, where our laws of physics make sense, where they still work, and we can say something about how the universe evolved. So specifically what I work on, two kind of things that could be produced from interesting models of inflation. And these are primordial black holes. So these are a kind of black hole which, instead of your usual black holes, which would be formed from stars collapsing, these would be black holes which are formed from inflation in the early universe before there are any stars or anything around at all. So a different kind of black hole. And the other thing I look at, which is very exciting for the future, is seeing what the potential is for detecting gravitational wave signals coming from inflation. There's a lot of information that we could potentially get if there are detectable gravitational waves coming from the early universe. This could tell us a whole wealth of information about the universe even earlier than we currently know about.
All right, well, this is super cool, and I'd love to maybe talk at the end about the science of the early universe, being the bare bones of what's going on, because I think about the idea of everything condensing into a really, really tiny, hot, dense state, and I get kind of scared. I'm like, what on earth is going on? So yeah, I think that's super interesting. The first things first, obviously, you're an atheist. You don't believe in God. Hopefully, I have that right. So maybe talk a little bit about your journey and how your science has maybe impacted your views, or maybe it hasn't at all, and why are you an atheist, Matt?
That's a big question. But yeah. So originally I come from a family that was never particularly religious or religious minded. They weren't atheists, but they weren't practicing Christians or anything like that either. It was the only thing I ever heard about religion and things like that was singing hymns at school. And that was about it, really. So I come from a background where there was never really any pressure one way or the other in terms of worldview and this kind of thing. Now, obviously, I study physics now, but actually, I didn't actually like physics up until quite late into school. I found it very bland, very kind of intuitive, and I just got the impression that everything about the universe was kind of already known. It was already known. There was nothing more to know, and learning about physics in any more detail was just learning little kind of not very interesting details about the world and how it worked mechanistically. Didn't seem very interesting to me. I didn't really like it. But then what was really a turning point for me is when I came across some quantum physics ideas and started seeing kind of popular quantum theory videos on YouTube and reading popular science books on quantum theory. And after encountering that, what I really realized is that there's this whole bizarre way that the universe actually seems to work, which I hadn't expected at all. It was completely counterintuitive. And I found it completely shook kind of what I thought the world was. I thought it was all known and that it was all very reasonable and intuitive, and quantum physics was the complete opposite of this. So this made me think, the world is actually really interesting, it seems. There's actually some really weird stuff going on. So I wanted to learn more. And I took physics up through school properly, and then started my degree in physics and philosophy, is what my degree is in. So I have a background both in physics and philosophy. And the reason I took that is because my primary interest at this stage is just in the world, how the world works, how reality works at various different levels. Science and physics study it at certain levels, and then philosophy, there's some fascinating crossover between the two subjects, even though they're approaching essentially the same question from different sides. And so being interested in how the world works, how reality works, what reality is, being interested in these questions inevitably then leads to asking the question, well, is there some God? Is there some deity? Is there some kind of first cause which is personal, has a mind? That's a question that's inevitably going to come up if you're interested in what the world is and how the world works at a fundamental level. So I kind of, for a couple of years, I kind of flitted back and forth between Christianity and atheism. I was in a kind of little social club that was a social club, but had a little religious element to it. It was at the church, and so at the end of each evening, there was a little kind of Bible session, and then there was also at the end of the year in summer there was a big Christian camp in the UK, which we all went to, and it was all about sharing and teaching Christianity. And during that, for various reasons, I came to think, this is a really I see the merits of this idea, of this philosophy, of this theology, and decided for myself that I thought this was something I wanted to pursue further. So I started reading more. I started reading the Bible in more detail. But then simultaneously, I also came across the likes of Dawkins and Hitchens, and so there was kind of this clash between two different, very competing worldviews, and so I just wanted to find out as much as I could about all of this stuff, because at the end of the day, it's an exceptionally important question. So I just wanted to find out everything I could about this, and eventually, after immersing myself in these ideas and these arguments, I found myself eventually very firmly on the atheist side. I could explain why.
Yeah. So like, what are some, so you talked about, like, you're kind of on the fence, and you studied the arguments like push you towards atheism. What are some of the arguments that like pushed you towards like the atheist side of things?
So I think what ultimately it comes down to for me is that I'm interested in what can provide the best explanation for what we see around us in the world. And science is something which it gives you an understanding and explanation of lots of things in the world, independently of religion and philosophy. But also, theism is something which makes claims about the way the world is. And in being able to evaluate those claims and compare them to things that we see and we observe, you can then make a judgment on do I think that theism is providing me with good explanations, with satisfying explanations for what I see around me, or doesn't it? And what I ended up on is that what I ended up concluding is that actually, for me, there seemed to be a lot of observations, a lot of features of the world, which to me, I think, on theism, are explained quite poorly. Okay, on naturalism, they may not have explanations yet, but not having an explanation is not worse than having an explanation that's bad or unsatisfying. Sometimes it's better just to say, we don't know what the answer to this question is. It's pending further investigation, but I can recognize that some of the explanations on the table are unsatisfying or don't seem to work very well. So I mean, some of the problems which make me feel this way are fairly standard. There's kind of two elements to this. There's some observations which I think are incompatible with or inconsistent with various claims made by some of the more common theisms, and there are some observations which I think are just explained badly in theism compared to naturalism, compared to an atheistic worldview. So some of the things that I think are incompatible, I think the problem of evil is something that's incompatible with theism. I think that miracles are so theism may, or certain strands of theism may claim that miracles occurred. I think this is incompatible with what we know about the world. And then there are other things which I think theism just provides poor explanations for. One, for example, I think, and this is something that I feel quite strongly, is the existence of many religions, the existence of so many different mutually contradictory or inconsistent religions, I think is something that a naturalistic standpoint can account for quite well, and a theistic one, I've never seen a very good explanation of why there are so many religions of all these different kinds. I think morality, particularly the existence of people like psychopaths and sociopaths, is something that I think is difficult to account for in theism rather than naturalism. And also the existence of animals. I've always found that the existence of animals feels like something that there doesn't feel like there's any reason for their existence in the theism, in Christianity or Islam, whereas in naturalism there is this you have evolutionary processes which produce all kinds of different life, all kinds of different animals. You can't have humans without animals. But on theism, I see no reason why you can't have humans and no other kinds of animal, for example. These are things which I think theism doesn't explain these things very well, whereas on naturalism, on atheism, these are things that make sense based on the science that we currently know.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Matt. That's really great. And I'd love to have a conversation about like evil or miracles or pluralism, but I'd like to focus on God and physics today, especially.
Yes. Also, those first things are things that I'm not necessarily an expert in. These are just things that I've come across and I've read the arguments in a little detail, but not much. Mm-hmm. But yeah, physics is what I am much more comfortable talking about in detail.
And it's what I'm not comfortable talking about at all. So I'm stepping into the deep waters, which is why I love this conversation, because I'm like, well, I don't know a lot, but I know some, but nothing like the level you do. So that's why I'm super pumped. So like, would you say like one of the things you talked about, like supporting like atheism or naturalism, was the idea that like science has an understanding of the world like without like a need for like a God? So like, would you say then like the science like confirm, or I guess you're obviously not going to say it confirms that God exists, like would the science like lead to like disconfirmation of like God, or would you say like more maybe like science just like isn't relevant to trying to, when thinking about like is there a God or not? Where are you on that kind of question?
So let's start off with a situation where science would not necessarily be relevant to the question. And that's if you just have a plain kind of deism. If you're just trying to investigate the claim, is there a supernatural entity? Is there a deity? Science really, at least in its current form, has very little to say about that. There's nothing really that follows from deism concerning that follows about the natural world from that hypothesis alone. So science being concerned with the way of what the world around us works, there's nothing it really can say about whether a God exists. Okay. But that's not what most people believe in. Most people aren't just deists, believe in some supernatural entity and don't make any claims about its properties or its desires or these kinds of things. What theisms say are that God has certain properties. And once you give God these properties, it then means something about how the world around us is going to turn out. Okay. The claims that are made in theism are claims which are about or entail something about the world around us. And so what science can do, because that's science's primary domain, the world around us, what science can do is it can cross-check these claims. It can analyze these questions, analyze the world around us, and see whether these claims are something which can be backed up, are backed up by what we see in the natural world, or whether these are things which actually the natural world looks very different to what we'd expect based on the claims of different religions and different theisms. Now, what I think, so I think this is the case in various areas, physics and science. But what I think is quite interesting is that science today is seen as something which is very mechanistic, very impersonal, and very disconnected from religion. There was kind of this thing a bit ago that science and religion were these non-overlapping magisteria, that they had nothing to say about each other, they didn't communicate at all. And now it's certainly true that religion deals with some things which science doesn't really touch so much, things like ethics. Science, at least in its current form, doesn't really have much to say about these kinds of things, the way you should live your life. But when it comes to the natural world, then there is some overlap, which both of these magisteria are saying things about. But back in the day, we're talking kind of medieval era, this kind of time, science was really a branch of religion. The scientists in the medieval era were all monks or friars or bishops. They were all religious people working in institutions, and what they saw themselves as doing was looking at how God's creation worked. Science was a branch of theology in that kind of sense. You're just looking at this, God's created this world, let's go find out about it. Now, what's happened over time is that as science has progressed, as science has gone on and on and on, there have been several episodes in the history of science's development where actually what we found really diverges from what we'd expect based on the claims of Christianity, for example. So I think one of the key examples of this would be the formulation and discovery of evolution, the theory of evolution by natural selection, that biological organisms are not irreducibly complex. We're hugely complicated systems, but our complexity is something that can come from a long drawn out process over time, being built up and built up. Okay. But this isn't necessary. This didn't have to be the case. This didn't have to be what we found. We might have done science, started biology, and actually found that all biological organisms were actually irreducibly complex, that there was no natural explanation possible for the existence of irreducibly complex biological organisms. If we found that had been the case, then this would have been a huge bonus, a huge confirmation for what's claimed in Christianity, that we're designed, that we're designed and created by God. We could have found that. So people used to wonder how the sun was still shining. Okay, chemical reactions only last for a certain amount of time. They don't release that much energy compared to nuclear reactions. So people wondered why the sun could have lasted so long to permit evolution over billions of years. Well, what we found is that actually the way the sun produces energy is by nuclear reactions. These can last much longer time, and so there is no mystery. But that isn't necessarily what we could have had to have found. We could have found that actually the sun was composed of the way the sun got its energy was just through chemical reactions, and that it should have burnt out a long time ago, based on if we're assuming that the Earth has existed and the sun has existed for billions of years. And if we'd found that, then we might have had to have said, okay, it's a bit weird, but I guess the sun must have appeared only 4,000, 6,000 years ago, and maybe the Earth is much younger than we thought. But that's not what we found. What we found is that the sun burns through nuclear fusion, and so We have reason to believe it's been burning, and the Earth's been here, and the sun's been here for billions and billions of years. So there are many avenues in the history of science which could have been taken where religious claims were confirmed by what we saw in the natural world. It's only because at kind of every junction we found that science kind of disagrees with what religions have been claiming, that science is now at this stage where it's seen as totally independent. It's the study of the way the world works independently of religion, and you can be religious and believe in science, or you can be religious and deny science. We've got to that stage now. So yeah, the kind of impersonal, irreligious, mechanistic picture of modern science is not something that was built into science. It's something that we've arrived at because it seems time and time again what we've learned about the natural world is counter to what we would have expected based on religion and in particular Christianity. And I think that's something, for me, that's something quite telling, that how the natural world actually seems to work doesn't involve any appeal to claims that are made in Christianity, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think that's great. So if I'm tracking with you, Matt, that kind of idea here is that a lot of times in the past, theists would point to like certain like domains of science that we didn't like fully understand as like signs of like here's like where like divine intervention may be like needed. So like, for example, just going back to like evolution. So like, people would be like, hey, like, how do we get this like super complex system? It seems like, it can't just come about like by some natural process. So there must be like some sort of like creator intelligence, God. And obviously like there's Darwinian theory now, which seems to challenge that notion. Or there's been many models of evolution, but like evolutionary theory in general has challenged that notion of saying, hey, there's no need for like direct intervention here. We just have a process that unfolds. So it seems like in your view, then like that's going to kind of count against God. And when we look at like other like scientific mysteries, like we could talk about like fine tuning or like cosmology, as we get to in a little bit here, you're going to say like a similar thing of like, we may not have the answer, but we have this trend of like seemingly theistic explanations just turning into things that science can explain. And it's just kind of like, that's probably the route that's going to be as we progress in like our understanding of the world. Am I tracking with you?
Essentially. And you say fine tuning, well, this is kind of the next junction, which science has now arrived at, where, this is something that is unexplained, whereas things like complex life and the age of the universe are things those are things that are explained. What is unexplained now is the values that various physical constants take. This is something that is explained, and again, we see that we've got two junctions. Perhaps there's one junction which points the way of kind of things like multiverses, or there's lots of other physical suggestions as well. But there's all these kind of purely naturalistic physical suggestions, and there's also the suggestion that, well, the universe was designed. God picked out these particular constants in order for complex intelligent life to evolve. So we've got this junction again. Now it'd be very interesting to fast forward 100 years or so in the future and see whether we end up with some observational evidence for the existence of extra universes, and whether science has again gone the route of a naturalistic explanation over a theistic one. But because it seems in the history of science so far, it's almost always gone the route of naturalistic explanation. We don't need to appeal to God. My bet then is that it will continue to be this case. This way.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. So one thing I've been wondering about, and I'm just going to try to flesh this out and talk, and hopefully it'll make any sense. But I've been wondering, like, so you talked about like the deistic God, or there's like an impersonal being, and like science doesn't really say anything about that because it's not like the deistic God intervenes in the world. And then you talked about like the theistic God, where there were expectations that like God would have to be like the cause of like the creation of human beings or things like this. And what I'm wondering is like, could there be like a middle ground? Like obviously, like I'm a Christian, I'm a theist. I want to affirm that like a theistic God exists and like lives in a world that like does miracles and things like this. But one of my thoughts recently is like, what if God just, and I'm not committed to this, but it's just something I've been thinking about, is like, what if God creates a world that can just like naturally unfold? Like you could like I create a process, and like there's debates within like evolutionary theory on like, is it like a very like random process, or is it more goal oriented, or things like this? Like, what if God just creates a process that can naturally unfold and create life? Because it seems like to me, like a lot of the things you're saying, like that kind of theism, like that's not really going to be challenged by like evolutionary. I mean, you could run problem of evil arguments, but like evolutionary theory itself isn't going to really challenge that like understanding of like how God interacts in the world. What do you think?
No, you're right. So the fact that science keeps going these naturalistic routes would then not be a surprise, because God has set up the world in a way that it is purely natural. There's no intervention needed. That's all fine. And also this would remove my objection that I think miracles are incompatible with science as we know it, because no miracles would happen. It all evolves. It's all set up. It's all set up kind of in advance, and it goes. Yeah, that's fine.
Well, I would just clarify with my model. I would say something like miracles are still possible, and like they still happen. It's just not with like the scientific like God's not miracling in things at the Cambrian. According to this model, I'm thinking about like there's not like at the Cambrian explosion. There's not these like 24 miracles that happen and boom, the next step kicks in. It's more of like creating like a teleological process that kind of progresses towards like today.
I thought you said though that this wasn't a God who intervened at all. This was.
Oh, I meant like in terms of like. I'm sorry. I meant in terms of like where there's those needs for like scientific explanations is kind of what because you talk to me and things like this. And I'm like, what if he just creates a process that like allows for evolution? I'm trying to allow for like the day-to-day miracles that like the resurrection of Jesus, for example. So yeah.
Okay, fine. So let's just take it then that you're just setting up a naturalistic process, and this is how the world evolves, or how it develops. Okay, then yes, then you would expect that science keeps taking these naturalistic routes, and there's a naturalistic explanation for all these things. Okay, yeah, that's fine. But but the other claims that are made in various religions and in various branches, more claims about the world are made than just that. Okay, you start introducing properties such as loving nature of God. You start introducing properties that ideas like the universe and the planet was designed for us, and these are things then that even if the process of science was set up by God, you can still question, why would they have done it that way? This seems a bizarre way to set things up based on the goals that were outlined in something like the Bible. So, for example, if you wanted to design a universe for beings such as ourselves, it makes very little sense to me why the cosmos is so large. If your entire focus really is on just humans on a little planet, I don't understand why there's all this extra space, why there's all this extra cosmos, this vast, unbelievably huge cosmos with trillions and trillions of stars and even more planets. It doesn't make any sense to me why that's around. That to me it seems much more likely to me that would exist on a naturalistic hypothesis, which kind of spews out all these different planets and spews out all these different possibilities essentially randomly, versus the view that you have an intelligent designer who's meticulously designed this Earth, this universe for ourselves. That the current state of our universe looks to me very much like how it would, assuming natural processes, kind of non-teleological processes versus a teleological one.
Okay. One thing I'm thinking about is like, so let's say for the sake of like this conversation, like I just grant you like, okay, like the size of the universe is super surprising on like the idea of like God existing. And I'm not claiming like there is some sort of perfect like explanation, because I have ideas, but there's nothing like I'm like, oh, this is it. I got it. I know why there's a trillion stars out there. Go home, Matt. Nothing like that. But like I'm wondering, like, so let's just say for the sake of this conversation, it's surprising on theism that there's this super like big giant universe. I wonder, like, isn't that just surprising on like atheism or naturalism? True. Because what about like atheism or naturalism saying like reality is like there is no God, reality is like fundamentally indifferent? What about that predicts that there'd be this giant universe? Like, I don't really see anything there.
Well, just on atheism, atheism doesn't really say anything about what you'd expect particularly.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're saying what we would expect on an alternative view, well, we form our alternative view based on what we understand from science so far, and the understanding we seem to have from science so far is that what the world is it's full of these regularities. It's full of these kind of law-like. It's composed of all these rules and things obey. And what they are, they're mathematical rules, they're mathematical relations. If you take the view that actually what a reality is, what a universe is in some sense a kind of physical structure or mathematical structure with all these different relationships between its parts, then you can start asking, well, what would you expect on that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we have a certain part of that structure, we have certain laws which govern planet formation, which govern the evolution of the universe, the late time evolution of the universe. We know what those laws are essentially, and we know that they'll generate planets, they'll form solar systems, and you'll get planets of all sorts of different makeups and sizes and atmospheres. And based on those laws, if we had a tiny universe, then we wouldn't expect to be here, because the probability of getting a planet like ours is very, very tiny, with the properties like ours is very, very tiny. And so this explains then why we have such a big universe, because in order for us to be here, we need a big universe, assuming these laws of planet formation and stellar evolution and late time universe evolution. We need a big universe for us to exist, because the chances of a planet like Earth existing is very, very small. And so the only way that you're going to get an Earth-like planet is if you have a massive universe with loads and loads of different planets produced, and one of them happens to have the right properties, and that's the one that we find ourselves on. And obviously, this is exactly what we're trying to do then in the case of fine-tuning of the physical constants. What we want to say is that, okay, yeah, sure. The values of the constants that we find they are very rare, it seems. Most values of the physical constants will not permit any kind of life that as we know it. And so we can say, well, what would we expect then on naturalism? Well, what we'd expect on naturalism is for something to be some process that produces a vast quantity of different universes with lots and lots of different constants. And so we happen to find ourselves in one which has the right constants. Right? So you can kind of see that there's this kind of problem which the kind of fine-tuning ideas of we've got a case where we've kind of been through the logic and been through the story already, just in discovering that there's all sorts of different planets, and the laws of planet formation don't determine that you're definitely going to get a planet like Earth every time. Most likely you'll get a completely different planet, big gassy planets like Jupiter. And then there's a story where we're kind of still in the middle of, where we've recognized that not all constants are going to work, but we haven't seen yet evidence that there's this big multiverse with a process producing all sorts of different universes with different constants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think it's gonna come down to our overarching theories of the world, and I would push back and say, isn't that and I'm not gonna say we don't have to get into this, but well, isn't that multiverse you can explain maybe all these things, but isn't that going to be a super complex theory or something like that? And that's where about we have.
So not necessarily. So for example, the theory that I work on, inflation, we propose inflation to deal with much more immediate problems. The more immediate problem that we had with the Big Bang model, or the old pure hot Big Bang model, there were two kind of key problems which seemed to surface, and these were the flatness problem and the horizon problem. In short, the flatness problem is basically that the universe today is far flatter than we should expect. If there's any deviation, any tiny deviation from flatness in the early universe, you expect the universe today to be much more curved. Okay, it's something like the curvature of the universe has to be tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60 or something like that that's the maximum deviation you can get away from flatness in the early universe to get our universe today being as flat as we observe it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the hot Big Bang cannot account for that. And another thing that the hot Big Bang cannot account for is that what's called the horizon problem. And this is when you look at a map of the cosmic microwave background. I'm sure, hopefully most of you, everyone's seen it, that kind of blue and green little oval where we've plotted across the sky. This cosmic microwave background is the first light we see from the universe. And what it's formed of is it's around, I think, 10 to the 80 different patches, which should all be causally disconnected from each other. Okay, all these patches would never have had any causal contact, would never have communicated with one another. They've never interacted ever in the history of the universe. And so, what was very puzzling on the Big Bang, on the original Big Bang model, is that all these different regions have the same temperature. Okay, this is a puzzle. How can completely disconnected regions? How can all these disconnected regions, which have never interacted, never been in thermal contact, how can they all have the same temperature? How do they know what temperature to be? And so these two problems are with the original hot Big Bang model. And so what the theory of inflation does is it provides a mechanism which both drives the universe towards flatness in the early universe. So it's a dynamical process that, regardless of your initial conditions, if you have inflation for long enough, the universe gets flat enough. And also it means that because the universe is expanding at such a fast rate initially, lots of patches on the sky which used to be in causal contact got pushed apart. And so they used to be in causal contact, equilibrated to the same temperature, but were then pushed apart, which is why we now see them as being completely separated, completely disconnected on the sky. So inflation explains these two problems, and that's what the original motivation is. Now, what is kind of weird about the mechanism of inflation is that if you have inflation, it kind of entails that inflation doesn't just happen once; it doesn't really ever stop. So what we've done is we've proposed this theory which solves problems with the Big Bang theory, and it seems to solve them well. There's some experimental evidence for inflation. It explains the problems that it set out to. It seems like a decent theory, but there's lots of blanks that we need to fill in still. But a consequence of this nice theory that seems to explain what we observe is that you'll get lots of different causally disconnected regions of space-time, possibly with different laws of physics, possibly with different constants, emerging in a much larger kind of bulk. Without us kind of putting anything into the theory we've come up to explain observations we've already seen entails the existence of more universes than just our own, more space-times than just the one that we live in.
And here's a stupid question: Are these universes? Are these before our inflation, during our inflation, after our inflation, the inflation of our universe? What are these things about?
So I think the best way to put it is that there's kind of like this massive space-time, and it's all inflating. All parts of this space-time are inflating, and then in certain patches, you get a vacuum decay, and the inflation stops. And that's when the hot Big Bang starts. So inflation is kind of always going on, but for our universe, it stopped a long, long time ago. So what you get is that in lots of different places, because this stopping is a probabilistic process, means it doesn't just happen once and that's it. It's got to happen in lots of different areas over time, and it doesn't necessarily happen in all of them. But at a certain place, inflation stops and you get a hot Big Bang. And so so it happened for our universe, but then there's also lots of other patches in this larger space-time where inflation stops and a new kind of bubble universe is produced. But all these bubbles are completely disconnected from one another because the space between them is inflating at this colossal rate that they're just completely out of causal contact. So the picture that you get emerging very naturally from this model of this theory of inflation, which we propose to solve observational problems, is you get this massive, you have this massive inflating space-time where different parts of it stop inflating, and these are points where big bangs happen and universes like ours form. So you get this bubble universe kind of picture. But yeah, what I was saying originally is that the multiverse isn't something that's necessarily any more complex than the theories that we currently need to explain observations. We introduce inflation to explain observations that we need to explain. These are problems. These are observations that need explaining, and so we introduce this new this framework, this new mechanism. And if inflation is the way the early universe operated, well, then multiverses are just a consequence of it. They're no more. It's not an addition to the theory. They're there in it. They're in there naturally.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Here's something. I guess here's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about complexity. Maybe we're going far off the track. I think this is good, so I think it's helpful for people.
Sure.
I'm not necessarily thinking about when I think about like saying that like an idea is complex. I mean, there's different ways you can take it. What I meant to mean was thinking about when I think about like theism and atheism and things like this. I try to think about like what's like bedrock fundamental to reality. It's like for the theist, they're going to say like I'm going to say it's God. God is fundamental, and out of Him comes everything else. And what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about complexity is like that for like the atheistic or naturalistic like explanation. So like let's say that like reality is fundamentally like this like inflating multiverse or something. And I'm sorry if I'm sure I'm misunderstanding you because this is not my area.
That's fine.
So before all the comments are like, Zach just doesn't get science. I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. That's why I'm having this conversation. So what I'm thinking is like, so let's say it's just the multiverse. And I'm going to wonder like, what are the parts of this? Like, is it limited in any sense? And like, what's going on here? Are there like laws that govern the multiverse? And just like, to me, like the more you fill in that you have to fill into like your fundamental feature, the more complexity you're going to add. And the more you have to add, I'm gonna say, hey, like look at this theism, Matt. It's chilling, you know. We got like a perfect being, a mind that's just like absolutely perfect. I'd say like, you know, like it's a pretty simple view. So does that make sense with what I'm thinking about?
Oh
like,
yeah,
complexity?
Yeah, totally. No, that makes perfect sense. And I mean, the problem with science and basing a naturalism off science at the moment is that we don't know what this ultimate kind of metaphysical fundamental entities are. In science, we're working very much from the top down. We see things and observe things at a very high level, a very complex level, and we're trying to work our way down. And that's very difficult. It's much easier to start with the basics and work your way up. But that's not the problem we've got. We've got to do the opposite. So we don't know what the basic constituents are. If we knew that, then we could say a lot more about whether a multiverse is something any more complex than a single universe, or whether, and things like that. Ultimately, whether there are multiple universes out there, whether there are multiple spacetimes out there, is going to depend on what the fundamentals are. Okay. Once you get down to the singularity of the Big Bang, the singularity is just a word we have for where the mathematical forms for laws that we have break down. They don't work anymore. But something physical will still be going on there. It will just obey higher energy laws than we currently have access to. The laws of physics that we work with are what are called effective laws, low energy laws. They would be derivable from the true, let's say, theory of everything in a low energy limit. So we work with these laws, but we're very aware that there's this kind of high energy, what's called UV, ultraviolet, theory, which these laws will be derived from, but is much more fundamental. Now, as you're going towards the Big Bang, as you're going to much, much higher energies, your effective laws break down because there are degrees of freedom from the higher energy physics which are going to become important, and you can't ignore them anymore. And so when you're getting close to singularity, what's important are going to be these extra degrees of freedom which we don't currently know what they are. Okay, there's going to be elements of this theory. The fundamentals of this theory are going to be important. We don't know what this theory is yet, so we don't know what happens. So whether it's very natural for extra universes to be produced, for space-times to form in lots of disconnected space-times to form, that's going to depend on what the fundamental theory says, what's in that fundamental theory. But at a very speculative level, theists can say that they base their reality on God, and that's their foundation for everything. Science-based atheism or naturalism currently doesn't have that. But in my own opinion, this is a question I'm interested in. It's something I'd like to think about. And the current candidate that I have for that is mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that's the best candidate I can think of at the moment. That essentially, mathematics is what exists. Everything is a mathematical. What exists is mathematical structures. And so if our reality is one of these particular mathematical structures, then it may just be the case that one of the laws of this mathematical structure is that you have lots of these different disconnected spacetimes being produced. And so this doesn't add any complexity to the mathematical structure in a way. It's one kind of unified structure. It's one mathematical framework. It's one structure. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I don't have too much to add to that. What do you want to take this? Like, we talked about kind of like the relationship between science and religion. Yeah, where do you want to take this conversation?
Well, we can talk. We can put this into talking about more specific arguments if you like. Things like
let's do it. So
and fine tuning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the obviously the most common thing, especially when you get into like apologetics or like things like this, is the claims that that cosmology is going to support a beginning of the universe. There's different things like you talk about like the Borg-Vilanken theorem or radio background, microwave background radiation, like things like this. So what do you think of this? Obviously, you're not convinced or you'd be a theist. Where do you think this? Where is cosmology? Let's just start with this. Where is cosmology in saying the universe is finite? Is it leaning that way? Is it leaning against the other way, or are we just kind of left in the middle saying we really don't know?
Realistically, we really don't know. So some physicists think that have what they think are very strong reasons for presuming that everything in physical reality is finite. That there's no such thing as the infinite in physics. It could be the case. Their reasons are decent ones. I sometimes find myself thinking that that's more the way to go, but I've never seen any good reason, I don't think, for that infinities are impossible in nature, and this in a sense comes from two places. It comes from my more speculative view that I think that everything is a mathematical structure, and to me, infinities make perfect mathematical sense. They're a perfectly valid mathematical structure, and so I see no reason why various quantities in physical reality can't be described by infinite, can't be described using infinite mathematics, transcendental mathematics. So I see no reason from that for excluding infinities from nature. But also, I've never been particularly convinced by any of the various philosophical paradoxes with infinity that you can look up. Hilbert's Hotel, Grim Reaper paradox, all these things I think are fascinating. I really like going into them and exploring them. But I think every time I've looked at them, I've always just thought, this is an argument about that it's counterintuitive. This isn't an argument that there's an actual contradiction or a paradox. And yeah. I think it's because you're not going to be able to derive a paradox just from the mathematics, because the mathematics, as far as we're aware, is perfectly consistent. So the way that these paradoxes have to derive a contradiction is bringing in assumptions about how the physical world works and saying that if the physical world, if there are certain things in the physical world that obeyed the principles of transcendental mathematics, then you'd arrive at paradoxes where there's a contradiction between how we expect the physical world to behave and how transcendental mathematics would tell us that this system would behave. And this is kind of, you're bringing in assumptions about how the physical world is going to behave. And this is a problem because we've never encountered an infinite quantity in the physical world so far. Perhaps they are there, but we just haven't encountered them. For example, the key candidate for this is space. There's absolutely no reason at the moment, one way or the other, to believe that space is infinite or finite in extent. There's absolutely nothing we can tell you about that at the moment. There's a certain horizon which we get to, and that horizon's there because light only has so long to reach us, and so that's the furthest we can see. But when we look at things on this horizon, nothing weird's happening. There doesn't appear to be any kind of boundary effects or anything happening there. It's not a hard boundary. It's just a place we can't see beyond. And so we have absolutely no idea if space just extends past that point infinitely, or whether it comes to a stop at some point. There's absolutely nothing we know, nothing we can say about that at the moment.
So, or am I interrupting you?
I was remembering what the original question was as well.
I asked, yeah.
I guess it's just worth saying as well that in terms of time as well, thinking about whether reality kind of goes infinitely far back in time, that's something which is lots of very interesting considerations going on there as well, both in philosophy and in physics. I think the only thing that physics at the moment can currently say is that the Big Bang is not. Physics is not saying that the Big Bang is the first moment in all of reality. That's not what the Big Bang theory is saying. All the Big Bang theory says is that we have an incredibly good physical model of our universe and its evolution, and we can model its history exceptionally well. But then there's a certain point in the past where our model breaks down. The universe is in a very different state. It's in a very high energy state. It's in exceptional circumstances. Our theories no longer work. And so at that point, there's nothing more we can say. And so, that's all the Big Bang theory is saying. There's a special point which we currently can't kind of see beyond. Whether there's something beyond it, we don't know. We're not saying that there's nothing beyond it, but we're also not saying that there's something beyond it. All we're saying is that this point where we can't currently say anything sensible about before it, that's all we're saying.
Here's what I'll tell you what I think as an uneducated person on the nature of this is the way I've always I go back and forth. But the way I think right now is I think about the idea of we talked about in the beginning, or you talked about in the beginning, is the universe coming from a very hot, dense state. And I'm just I try to imagine in my mind all of reality fitting within something that's a fraction of the size of this smart pencil I have right now. Mm-hmm. And I'm just to me, when I think about it, I'm okay, one idea is the universe is finite. And I'm I guess if the universe is finite, it seems to make sense. I guess it would kind of expand outwards and maybe it was all together at one point. But if the universe is infinite, how likely is it that at one point everything would be in this hot, dense state? And I would say it just seems to me when I think about it, not very likely. And obviously, there's a lot you could say and, you have your theories and I'm not saying it's impossible to. It's just for me intuitively when I think about it, that's kind of where I land when thinking about the science of the early universe and things like that.
It's an interesting point to make because I think what this actually touches on is kind of the problem of almost the problem of entropy, and the arrow of time. We're kind of wondering why does our universe look so asymmetric? Why, if we go backwards in time, entropy seems to decrease, and why in forward in time, entropy seems to increase. If anyone doesn't know what entropy is, the kind of it's just a very specific physical term for essentially the amount of order. When you go forward in time, the order you're getting more disordered. When you go backwards in time, you're getting much more ordered. So our initial state has a far lower entropy, has far more order than anything today or anything in the future. And so it's a massive question because ordered states are rarer. in the space of possibilities, ordered states are unlikely, or they're rare. There's very few possible states which are ordered, and lots of possible states which are disordered. So it's a big question of why is the early universe so ordered? Why is the initial state of the universe? Why does it have a very low entropy? And this is an open question. I think this is, without maybe knowing it, this is potentially what you're saying. How on earth was all this kind of stuff in one place? And it's an open question. It's an open question. And for example, one attempt to try and solve this problem is actually to say that the kind of Big Bang event is not the beginning of the universe, but actually just a special point kind of in between two universes going out on different sides. And that and if you introduce this, then you get a symmetry back to this. You've got a symmetry back to the situation. Time backwards and forwards. It doesn't actually matter. There's just this special point. So there's a very distinguished philosopher of physics, Julian Barber. He's got a popular science book on this. I think it's the Janus point. This is where he discusses something like this, where you can kind of solve this problem by extending the universe out the other side of the Big Bang and having this nice kind of symmetrical cosmology. I'm not sure I can go into much detail about how exactly that might address some of your concerns, but I think that's kind of along the lines that your question is actually probing.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I'm happy to leave it there because obviously there's a lot. Let's go over this briefly. What about fine tuning? So a lot of people would say like fine tuning is going to provide evidence for God. Looking at different physics, like earlier, like Matt, when you're talking about the 1 to the 10 to the 60th, what's going on there? Like it seems like there's some sort of fine tuning, which would imply like a designer or something. So when we're looking at like, let's just talk about the science of fine tuning. Is it fine tuned for like life? Do we not know? Or do we know it's false? Like, where are you with that?
So I think it's very clear that the claim that can very clearly be made, and there's a lot of evidence to back it up now, is that there's certain constants, 7 or 8 different physical constants, which govern the way the universe evolved, govern the strengths of the various forces, and this kind of thing. And these are 7 key parameters or so, which determine how the universe is going to evolve, how it's going to turn out. And what is established, I think, beyond any reasonable doubt, is that if you imagine being able to vary these constants in a range between any sensible values, the range of values of these constants which permits life is an incredibly tiny subset of the whole possible range. Okay, so it seems that there are far more values we can set these constants to where life almost certainly doesn't exist. I know this is something that some people like James Fodor say, for example. One of their objections to fine tuning is that we don't have a very good definition of life. It could be the case that is life in lots of these cases, but we just don't know. We're just not familiar enough with it. I disagree with that. I think it's very clear when we're varying these constants, what's happening is that the universe is collapsing basically instantly on itself, or expanding so fast that individual particles don't have time to communicate with each other. Like, this is the kind of universes we're talking about. And I think that it's very reasonable to say that these are situations where no conceivable life would exist. So I think so that's the claim, that very few of these values will end up in a life-permitting universe. Most choices will lead to a barren universe. I think that's what's established. Now, what people then jump to, which is not permissible without some further work. What most people jump to then is that the constants being the values that they are in our universe are very unlikely. The probability that our universe will be life-permitting is very, very unlikely, is the is the claim that is then made. But this is not a claim that follows from the fine-tuning evidence as we have it. Okay, all we know is that out of all the epistemic possibilities of what we can set the constants to, very few are life emitting. But we don't actually know what the probability of each of these values is, and we don't even know if they're physically possible alternatives. Okay, the only way that you can get, or the way that what you have to assume to get to our life emitting universe is very improbable. You have to assume that all of these different values are physical possibilities, and each of them, when we can apply the principle of indifference and say that they're all equally likely. If you assume these two things, then sure, the result is that our universe, having the life emitting constants that it does, is very unlikely. But these assumptions are not things which are to be taken lightly. Okay, these constants, they're not even necessarily things that are actually constants. These are simply numbers which are not determined by our current physical theories. These are numbers that are either can't be changed. So the obvious origin for these values that we have, where we think we can get these values in physics, is to appeal to some higher energy theory that we don't currently know about. These will either specify particular values for these constants, or a range, or some probability distribution over these values. So at the moment, we can't actually say that our universe is improbable. All we can say is that is what I said before. Most of the values that we can currently consider would result in a barren universe.
Okay, well, I think that's super helpful, Matt. Like, you're like saying, hey, like, there's a lot of ways, like, when we're looking at fine tuning, like, that things could go wrong. There's a lot of ways where the universe collapses, or like, it's not looking too hot for life. But then you're saying, like, hey, the question is really like, what is the probability of like having a universe like ours? And that's really, to you, where the mystery is, and that's going to run into a lot of the issues for fine tuning in your view.
Yeah, that's the unanswered question so far. Is our universe actually improbable? That's not a trivial claim. It doesn't follow from the fine tuning evidence that we have. But then, so go on. Yeah, you go on.
I say, what do you think then about like the principle of indifference? Like, people would say, like, hey, at least like conceptually, like there's a lot of different ways like the universe could go. So like on atheism, at least, like, if you're going to use indifference, like, you'd say like, hey, there's a bunch more different ways that you have to consider as like at least part of like at least the possibility space on atheism. Whereas like on theism, like those universes that like where there's no life probably aren't as likely, because God would like value agents and things like that. So like scientifically, like, is that principle of indifference something you just can't comment on, or like where is that, like, when we're looking at indifference from like the scientific account?
Well, it's an assumption, but it's not an unreasonable assumption, especially when we're looking at this question epistemically. And so I am in the camp where I think that fine tuning is something that needs to be explained by something at some point. Okay, epistemically, based on what we know, the universe with the constants with the values of the constants that we see is unlikely epistemically. Whether it's actually unlikely is something that we don't know. Okay, it could be the case that this is kind of the view that has been believed by various people at various points in history, that our universe is the only logically possible universe. If that were the case, then the probability of this universe having the constants that it does is 1. Okay, it's not unlikely at all; it's certain. So there's a distinction to be made between metaphysical probability, which is the actual probability of this universe having the constants that it does, and this is going to depend on higher energy theories of physics or something, or whatever lies beyond, and epistemic probability, which is all we can currently say something about. And epistemically, because we've got all these different possibilities and very few of them seem to permit life, it is reasonable to apply the principle of indifference and say that epistemically, we should not expect to see a universe with these values of the constants. And so I think fine-tuning is something that does cry out for an explanation. and then the step then is to then ask, well, what is a good explanation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Let's talk about this. Maybe we'll wrap up with this because it has been I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yes.
One of the things I've been wondering, at least this question is really pressing on my mind. Just get ready. Is I looking behind? I was looking behind your head at the beginning of this conversation, and I was like, why do physicists always have boards written with equations on the background? Like, what is going on with that? Can you explain? Can you explain that? Is it and here's the second part: is that better explained by theism or atheism? So yeah.
Okay, I like that. Well, why do we always have equations written down? Well, it's because the analogy I like to use, and this is what I used when I was a maths teacher, is you know fantasy novels, and they have a magic system, and their magic system sometimes relies on knowing the true names of objects. You have power over an object if you know its true name, and you can command it, and you can do stuff like that. Well, in our real world, what seems to me to be the equivalent of that in the real world is mathematics. Mathematics, there's this unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in describing the world around us. It feels almost like mathematics is the true name of things. So the way we write down mathematics is in a way conventional. The symbols that we use, the way we write it down, these are conventions. But what I feel very strongly is that these are symbols which are representing something that is real, something, and not only real but may be fundamentally real, the fundamental basis of everything, that we're mimicking these structures with the symbols that we use. So why do physicists always have equations on whiteboards behind them? Well, it's because that's what we have to work in. This is, if you're not working in maths, the statements you're making are too ambiguous, they're not precise enough, you're in danger of you're in danger of not saying anything at all. You're in danger of what you say having no meaning. Writing things down in mathematics makes it very clear what's going on, what precisely you're saying, and it's this kind of universal basis. You can either think of it as a building block or as a language in which we can talk about how the world works and the kinds of things we're saying about it and the kinds of way it might behave. So that's why we always have equations. I mean, the reason I have those equations behind me is just I'm trying to learn some of my quantum field theory a bit better for some of the stuff I'm working on, and so that's just me practicing. But the way to practice is to write down these equations, because this is essentially what these are describing, the way the world works. And if you can get familiar with how these symbols behave, then you become very good at being able to manipulate and deal with physical systems that you're describing. And that's something really magical, isn't it? That's by getting familiar with this system of symbols, you're also getting familiar with a physical system that you'll never lay eyes on it, and you'll never, me as a theoretical physicist, not an experimentalist, I'll never lay eyes on it. I'll never deal with individual atoms and individual particles, but I can work out exactly what they're going to do by knowing how this system of symbols works well enough. That's something really quite incredible. Now, whether this is something better explained on naturalism or theism, so I think what some theists, so actually, this is something which has always, or in recent times, has disappointed me about theism, is that there is no mention in the Bible, no mention in religion really of anything like this kind of power of mathematics. There's no mention of this amazing thing that we can do, which actually describes the way the world around us works. And I think that if I were to believe in a God, this mathematical system is incredible. This is something that I can't believe is not something that we were told about or that he was showing off about even. So what seems to me to be so fundamental to the way that the natural world works and to how reality works, it seems to me bizarre that would be left out of religion. And I think it is. I think I am right and justified in saying that it is left out, because the only real the only thing I can think of really that a theistic position on what mathematics is that I've ever heard of is just to say that they're kind of concepts in God's mind and this kind of thing. And to me, that doesn't really explain anything for me at all. Did these concepts pre-exist and they were then in God's mind? Were these concepts just thought up by God? Could he have thought up different concepts and there are different versions, completely different mathematics that could have existed? It doesn't seem to me to be an explanation that works very well. Now, I don't think naturalism necessarily explains this either. I think the unreasonable effectiveness in the natural sciences is not something that is necessarily explained just on naturalism. You just kind of assume that it works. You assume that, it's great. This mathematics seems to describe the world so well, and we can use it to learn things and to tell us what's going to happen. But that connection isn't really explained, and so this is why it's super speculative. I can't. There aren't loads of good reasons to believe it's the case, but for me, the kind of the worldview that makes most sense to me is to believe that mathematics is reality, and then the reason that mathematics is so good at describing the natural world is because the natural world is a mathematical structure.
Well, that's interesting. Matt, I think that's a good place to leave off, though. I think this is good. So, Matt, how can people follow with you, connect with you, things like that?
Yes. So my channel is on my name down here, Physically Debunked. I don't necessarily like my own name too much. I chose it a long time ago now when I was mostly going to be... What really bugs me was various much less educated theists than you making claims that relied on science that was completely wrong or inaccurate. Mm-hmm. And that annoyed me, so I wanted to debunk these very basic claims that appeared so often on Twitter and in various other places. Now I'm really less interested in that. I'm much more interested in just exploring these very interesting ideas in philosophy, theology, and science. And so it'd be nicer if I had a name that reflected that. But my YouTube channel is Physically Debunked, and what I have been doing most recently on there is just going through each of the premises of the various kind of traditional arguments for God's existence. So I've got the cosmological argument on there. I've got a version of the contingency argument on there. And I just go through the premises and explain why they might be good and where I think there's room to question them. And usually these premises, the way that we can question them relies on a lot of physics and science, and so it's a very interesting discussion that can follow. So yeah, Physically Debunked, that's YouTube, also on Twitter as that. I have a purely philosophy of science channel, which is called Shots in the Quark. But yeah, those are all the different ways you can follow me if you're interested. I presume many of your viewers are theists, and well, up to not necessarily my target audience. But well, I hope my discussions are always interesting, and I always try to make them much more about just talking about interesting ideas and concepts about the world, and much less about bashing theism or anything like that.
Well, I'd encourage people to check out Matt's channels. I actually hadn't heard of Shots in the Quark until right now. So I encourage, because if you're listening to this channel and you're a theist, I hope you're also listening to atheist agnostic channels that are very thoughtfully informed and providing the best of the other side. So I'd encourage people to check out Matt's channels. Yeah. If you're new here, though, I encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, and all that fun stuff. Thank you so much for joining me today, Matt. Really appreciate it. And thank you to all the listeners. Super appreciate all of you spending some time here with us today. And if you value our content, consider becoming a patron, patreon.com/adhereapologetics. And that's it. Thanks, Matt. One last time. Super great. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And have a good one, everyone. God bless. We'll see you next time.